Do you have documentation that these were the steps that were followed? That's the reason those questions get asked, is because we want you to be prepared in the event that you do have, a surgical site infection, that you can eliminate yourself or your department as the cause. Because it's all about a process of elimination with surgical site infection. And until you can fully eliminate yourself as the cause, then there's going to be that challenge. So.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line, where infection stops and information starts. You're listening to a special combined season of First Case and Transmission Control podcasts, bringing perioperative practice and infection prevention together to tackle one of healthcare's most persistent challenges, surgical site infections. Each episode will connect you with frontline staff, perioperative leaders, infection preventionists, and healthcare innovators sharing real-world strategies, stories, and solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, and from surveillance data to safer practice, we're breaking down silos and strengthening the systems that protect surgical patients. Welcome to Silo-Free Surgery.
Hello and welcome to a very special season opener for the Transmission Control and First Case podcast. This season, we'll be talking all about surgical site infection reduction on both the Transmission Control channel for our IPs and the First Case platform for all of our friends in the operating room. My name is Garrett Hollembeak, Editor-in-Chief of Transmission Control, and today we're joined by a familiar face for the First Case crew, but maybe not as familiar for Transmission Control, and that's Lindsey Joyce. Lindsey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Garrett?
Good. So for the folks, especially on the transmission control side that don't know you or your work, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career in healthcare.
Okay. So, hello, infection control. My name is Lindsey Joyce. I am a CVOR nurse and I am out of St. Louis, Missouri. I have been an OR nurse for 18 years and all 18 years in the OR went there straight as a new grad and have not left since. I have worked in level 1 trauma centers in St. Louis, in Houston, and in Dallas, and ended up moving back to St. Louis after I did some travel nursing in Texas for a while and found myself to the CVOR, where I currently circulate, scrub, cardiac, thoracic, endovascular, and new to us soon, we will start a robotic thoracic program. So we'll be learning about that shortly.
Very exciting. Gotta love robotics, and robotics in every surgical specialty, from knees to urology. And Lindsey, since you've lived and worked in both places, you might be the best person to answer whether Texas or St. Louis has the best barbecue. Do you have strong opinions on that?
St. Louis, yes.
Okay. Hey, we want the episode to start off with a bang, so that's a good point to start with. Well, thank you, Lindsey, for joining us, co-hosting this episode, especially. So we'll be right back.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ. Let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Our guest today is Jeremy Gibson-Roark. And Jeremy, definitely correct for the audience if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly. But tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience.
Yeah, my experience is very similar to Lindsey's. During nursing school, did do a stint in the ED nights, and then a little bit of a stint on the orthopedic floor. But when I got my license, I went into the OR and never left. I still consider myself an operating room nurse. I don't work in the operating room directly anymore. I work for DNV, which is an accrediting organization. I'm a standards application and interpretation specialist for them, which means I interpret our standards for both clients and for our survey teams that are out on the road and how they are applied during survey. So I've been in this role for a little over 6 months. Prior to that, I did survey organizations and did certifications in infection control and sterile processing. I do have to give the caveat, started off, sterile processing is my favorite department in the hospital. It's just so critical to the safety of patients and good outcomes, and I love them. So shout out to my sterile processing peeps, as well as my infection control peeps as well. So.
Jeremy, that's a great shout out because I feel the exact same way. My career in healthcare started in sterile processing as a tech on third shift. And then after a number of years there, I moved on to the dark side of infection prevention, where I was now kind of seeing SPD from an oversight and regulatory and infection prevention standpoint. And it is one of the areas of a hospital where the team just has to be perfect. And that through line carries through to the OR too. So it's a great correlation into our topic today. And this whole season, we're going to be talking about surgical site infections and really the ins and outs and building communication between the OR, between infection prevention. If nothing else, we want you to leave this season with a fire under your butt to break down the silos between the operating room and infection prevention. So to kick us off, Jeremy, I want to start with a big swing here, which is what is the biggest challenge organizations are facing when it comes to surgical site infections?
Well, the first thing is for it's really determining the source. There's so many factors. Number one, we're never going to be perfect. Okay. And perfection, I like to say it's not about perfection. It's about continual improvement. It's about knowing where you are and how can you improve from where you're at. So I hope this season, I think it's a great topic, and I hope that people just realize where they're at and they can make improvements from where they're at, because it's not about being perfect in everything you do. And when we talk about surgical site infections, you have so many factors that have to be considered to identify what is the cause or what is the source of a surgical site infection. Could it be operationally in sterile processing? Yes. Could it be the change? You've had a change in a patient population because you added a new service line. This patient population has higher comorbidities. That could be a contributing factor. The thing about healthcare that is challenging from any other environment is that you have humans dealing with humans. And we're all prone to human error, right? Operationally, from a clinical standpoint, we make mistakes, and that happens. But you also have the patient side of it. And, did they hear the preoperative instructions appropriately? And did they do everything that they were supposed to preoperatively? Are they doing what they're supposed to do postoperatively? So really, one of the biggest challenges is just identifying the source. If you have an increased infection rate, is identifying the source and really getting down. And that's, I think to your point of the whole series, I couldn't do it as a surgical services director. I mean, I had physicians to manage, anesthesiologists to manage, and patients to manage, and staff to manage. And, if you threw 3 surgical site infections on my desk and said, hey, I need you to figure out where these are coming from, there's just not enough time in the day. That's why that relationship with infection control is so critical in this environment, because your infection preventionists out there, they are trained. They have the knowledge and the experience to do that investigative work to help you at least eliminate some things and maybe concentrate on some others, and why that relationship is so critical in nature. But that to me is the biggest challenge, is identifying what is the true source of your increased infection rate, if that's what you're seeing. Or really, let's take it a step back and looking at the risk. What are your risks, right? I mean, let's not wait until we have an infection. Mm-hmm. Let's look at it beforehand and work with our infection preventionists to identify these are the risks in your department, because, Lindsey, you've worked in the OR, you can walk past something every day for like a year and not see it. And then one day you walk past it and you say, oh my gosh, that's been there for a year. And that's a huge infection risk, right? It's just that different set of eyes and having somebody come in and look at your risks, but maybe before you actually get to a surgical site infection.
I just found a door in our OR. I've been in my current facility for 9 years, and I just found a door that's an exit to the OR that I literally never knew existed.
Is that right?
So It's just, it's like you said, it's that fresh set of eyes, or having an eyes from a different perspective. So Jeremy, my question for you, for our OR perioperative friends, right? So why do you think it is so difficult to trace a surgical site infection back to one clear moment or one clear cause? I know we have, every OR will be susceptible to an SSI. That's kind of facts, unfortunately. And I feel like sometimes when management has brought it up to staff, that we've had this, or we're seeing this trend, the answers can be muddy. They can, there's nothing really clear. And that is not what staff obviously want to hear. Like, we are nurses, we are scrub techs, we are trained that we do the same thing, same way every time. So why don't you have this one answer for us right now? Or like, why are you bringing this information to us if you don't have a clear cause or one clear moment?
Yeah, and I think you have to look at the individual cases and what's going on. I mean, every situation is unique. If you're seeing a broad rise in surgical site infections, then there's probably an operational issue going on. So you're seeing it across service lines. Mm-hmm. There's probably some sort of operational issue that affects every patient. So that's where we're looking at, okay, do we need to look at what's going on in sterile processing? Do we need to look at what's going on in environmental services of cleaning the rooms? Do we need to look at our general practice of hand hygiene and scrub techniques? Those things that impact every single case. So, you're looking at it from that broad spectrum. If you see a spike in, let's say, just total knees, then you're able to focus, okay, now we're not having an issue anywhere else. It's just this. So now we can narrow our focus and say, okay, what are our processes here in total joints that differ from our other cases that might be the causative agent? Or, it's room specific. I mean, I've seen investigations where we have surgical site infections that are happening in a single room. Well, now we may be looking at our environmental control. Do we have something in the physical environment that's contributing to surgical site infections in this one room? So, it varies from case to case, and some of them you're able to pinpoint very easily. You've got, it's the same procedure with the same surgeon, with the same staff, and you're able to go in and say, and just do an quick observation, or not a quick, but, observations. And we notice that, we are not allowing our prep solution its appropriate dwell time because we're trying to turn over cases fast. And so, it's easy to say that that's the causative agent. The more difficult ones are when they're widespread. There are so many factors that can go into it, from, like I said, the physical environment, sterile processing, to environmental services. Those are the probably more challenging ones to investigate. And that's where you really do need your infection preventionists help just for those observations, for those, just to fetch out the data sometimes and say, yeah, these are all happening in OR9. Where OR leadership oftentimes doesn't have time to go through and sort through that data and look through that. That's why that partnership is so critical.
It's that application and a nuance that I think is really important, because nuance takes time. It takes a lot of information. It takes collaboration. And even a nuance with, what type of surgical site infections are we seeing? Are they surface? Are they deep? Are they organ level? And Lindsey, I'm curious, in your experience, is that broken down? So when IP comes and says, hey, we're seeing an increase in surgical site infections, this is a really broad category to bring to the OR. Are they distinguishing, we're seeing a lot of surface level ones, we're seeing a lot of deep, or we're seeing a lot of organ and space SSI?
I don't feel like I've ever seen, broken it down like that way. It's more just, they had a total knee and then developed redness and swelling and, pus, and then we cultured it, and now we got to go back to the OR. And sometimes it's not until you get into the OR and you re-incise that incision that you really can get an idea of exactly how deep it is. Because sometimes you can just make the small incision and, your infection is right there and comes on out. Other times you really got to dig and work for it until you actually get down to, a couple layers in and find it. I feel like in my experience, it's more just, hey, we've had an uptick in infections. And then, like Jeremy said, try to go, get to the root cause of, is it a overall OR widespread thing, or is it down to a specific service line or room or certain staff?
And here's another challenge. You bring up the different wound classifications there. A lot of those, if you're in an acute care hospital, you may never know about.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because they're being treated in the physician's office, and they're not a return to surgery because they haven't progressed to the level where they need to come back to the surgery. So that's another key piece that organizations, have to try to wrap their heads around, is how do we get to the data that we need to see the risk that we have before we get to the level where they're having to return to surgery, right?
Right.
So, having those good relationships with your physician practices so that the information's actually coming back to you as an organization when there are superficial infections, not cellulitis, but superficial infections associated with the surgery, that those are coming back to the organization, because those are the first indicators of, hey, we may have a situation going on that is occurring in our facility that we need to take care of. And if you're not getting that data, then it does then lead to, those more severe infections where we're having to go in and remove implants, or we're having to go in and do incision and debridements, and the patient outcomes are much more significant in those scenarios. So being able to collect the data is another challenge from a surgical site infection standpoint.
And that's a really good point, Jeremy. I feel like sometimes I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for the entire OR community, but I think that unless a patient comes back for, like you said, an IND or an explant or something like that, that if they don't come back to the OR, then that's not a surgical site infection in our mind, right? It's been taken care of, but doesn't need to come back to us. So it wasn't something that we may have potentially done. And there's so many cases and instances where we never hear about, like what you just mentioned, like they might have some redness, or, they go back to their physician with swelling, and we never hear sometimes some of that kind of information back to us. Yeah. But that should be communicated back to us so we can, like you said, let's catch it before it gets to something. But I think a lot of times, if it's not in the OR, we're not concerned with it or think that it pertains to us.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if we got the information, we would be concerned, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we can't act on information that we don't have.
Exactly.
And so, I think our goal from a surgical standpoint is, how do we eliminate ourselves as the cause? And that's the point in having the data and knowing, hey, we are seeing, these superficial infections occurring, and we want to make sure that our processes are in place, and we don't have something harboring in our OR that then is going to have a more significant impact.
I think that's where the education can be really powerful too, with surveillance definitions, and IP even going to the OR and saying, this is what a superficial infection is. You can swing a dead cat and get a SIP, and maybe because they just showed up at the ER 3 days later and they had some redness and they documented it. And so I think breaking down how surveillance works, because 10 superficial infections may garner a different process or different response than 10 deep in organ space SSI.
Well, and that's, they're going off the NHSN definitions for surveillance data. And unfortunately, many organizations only track those infections that they're required to track. And that is abdominal hysterectomies and colons. And so, we all do many other surgeries than that, but we're only tracking that because that's the only thing that we're required to track through NHSN. So you could have a whole, if you're not looking at the data and you're not surveilling your patient population, you could have a whole issue that you don't even know is out there. That's the scary part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you break that down a little bit more for us? What are some of the drawbacks to only doing, and I'll just say the bare minimum of surveillance of SSI?
I think that from a resource standpoint, that oftentimes is the challenge. Is it takes time. If you don't have a physician's office that's following up, then you've got to reach out and collect the data yourself. And so it's a resource situation sometimes where that's all that the resources that have been allocated, and that's all they can measure and track. I don't know that there's a benefit. I think we're all in this for patient safety, and we want to provide safe patient care. So the more surveillance we can do, the better data that we have that really informs our decision-making process. So, I don't know that there's a benefit to just, following NHSN data.
Yeah.
Now, you can follow it and you can choose not to report it. You're only required to report those that I indicated or whatever CMS decides in the next year that is reportable. You can track it. That doesn't mean you have to report it to NHSN, but you can use it for your internal purposes. And so, it's important, I think that you have as much surveillance as you possibly can so that, again, it's about identifying the risk early. Before we get to, some of these significant situations that you read in the news that have caused really negative outcomes for patients. And ultimately, you're talking about the reputation of your facility. You're talking about financial liability. It's significant. So.
And that's where we get into that dynamic between we saw something, it directly caused an SSI versus the correlating factors. And I want to pull on that thread a little bit. Jeremy and Lindsey, can you talk a little bit about how we see some certain elements as causal, certain elements as just a correlate? And I don't want to say just a correlation, but how often in SSI investigations are we able to say A to B, this caused this infection in the patient?
There are definitely some that are easy based off of the type of organism. So, if you have an aspergillus, that's coming somewhere usually from the environment. If you have it across multiple patients, this is kind of that single room scenario or a block of rooms, then you're going and looking in your air handling units. So, and you're swabbing the air handling unit, you find the same organism. There's your causative agent. Same thing, sometimes with the anesthesia machines and pneumonia, you can correlate. You can correlate it by the type of organism, and so I think that's where oftentimes your investigation begins, is the identification of the organism. When we get with some more common organisms, MRSA, things like that we see in healthcare more often. Then it becomes a little bit more challenging to find that true causative agent. But there are times you're able to directly link, but usually that's more rare than common.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with Jeremy there, that I feel like more times than not, you have to really do some investigative work to try and figure out where people are getting. And then sometimes for us too, it's they leave the OR, everything's fine, there's nothing wrong with the environment, but they get to say the ICU, or they get to a step down, and those areas might be having some kind of problems but there's it's not obviously as sterile, it's not as controlled. More and more people go in and out of the room, traffic's increased, and then they just unfortunately develop probably from a post-op standpoint due to a post-op area.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the point that there's so many factors, right? That you just don't have control over, and some of these infections might not pop up for 2 weeks later. Mm-hmm. Now we're 2 weeks out, and we're trying to figure out what happened in the OR 2 weeks ago. I don't know about you, Lindsey, but there were days I couldn't remember what the first case I did was, much less 2 weeks ago.
Garrett and I were just talking right before we started, and I couldn't remember what I did yesterday.
Yeah.
It's
So
the longer you're out from surgery, the more extrinsic factors that you have that could relate to it. What is the patient's, what have they come in contact with in the environment? What is their home situation like? Do they have pets? Do they have, whatever? Are they going back to, like we said, are they following post-op instructions? Are they using dial soap or whatever they're supposed to?
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that we do everything we can in the operating room. And when I say operating room, I mean operating room, sterile processing, perioperative services, to eliminate ourselves as the cause. So, that's where we have to put the best practices in place so that when those investigations do come through our areas and we're going down to sterile processing, and we can demonstrate that, yes, this was the set of instruments that was used on that patient. Here's their IFUs. Here's the washer cycle they went through. Here's the testing that washer went through that day. Here's the autoclave they went into. Here's the autoclave testing that was done that day. Here's the biologic that ran with that set. And so I can, if I have all of that documentation and my practices support it in the observation and the environment, then hopefully I can eliminate sterile processing as the problem, right? If I'm missing any of that, I can't do that anymore. So really it's about how to Lindsey's point, since we don't have control out of, what the patient goes to or what they're exposed to post-operatively, it is about what we can control intraoperatively and perioperatively that is so important, and why your surveyors, people like me, come in and they're asking for that level of documentation. They're asking, okay, do your sterile processing staff have access to the IFUs? Pull them. Let's see. Do you have documentation that these were the steps that were followed? That's the reason those questions get asked, is because we want you to be prepared in the event that you do have, a surgical site infection, that you can eliminate yourself or your department as the cause. Because it's all about a process of elimination with surgical site infection. And until you can fully eliminate yourself as the cause, then there's going to be that challenge.
So, Jeremy, I will ask you, now I will speak on behalf of my OR friends and the perioperative world. What is something that you wish the OR team can understand more about what infection prevention's approach to this investigation? Because we have had, fortunately, sometimes our IPs will come down and speak to the OR and speak to staff. And sometimes I've heard staff kind of think that they're being, as a department in general, we're being attacked, we're being accused. Well, these people don't work in the OR. These people, they haven't been a nurse. They may be a nurse, they may not be a nurse. They don't know what we do. And then it kind of comes a blame game and pointing fingers, and you're just out to get us, right? Yeah. So what would you like us OR nurses and scrub techs and assistants and everybody in the OR to know about where you're coming from as an infection preventionist into the OR?
I'm not going to lay that responsibility solely on the OR staff. I think that is a mutually, there are responsibilities on both sides to that equation. And I felt that way as an OR director. I had an infection preventionist that liked to do surprise audits that would come in, wouldn't include me on those audits. Yeah. Would take pictures of things, and then the report went to the CNO who I reported to. And so it was a very adversarial relationship just from the outset. I mean, not even during a surgical site infection, but just from a audit perspective. So some of that onus comes back to the infection preventionist and how they're approaching that interview scenario. If you come in with that kind of interrogative mentality, you're going to get an OR staff that is going to be standoffish and transparent. And it's really, it comes back to, that just culture and, being willing to be transparent and talk about things. The thing that I want everybody to take away is that nobody comes to work intending patient harm. If they do, hopefully, they're found out and they go to jail for it. But none of us come to work intending to do the wrong thing. We all got into the healthcare field to benefit patients and to hopefully perform safe patient care. So we're all on the same team and we're all human. We all make mistakes, and being able to be transparent and own up to the things you don't know or the things you're not familiar with or you're unsure about will only enable you to correct those issues in the future. And so it's not solely the OR's responsibility. I mean, I was an OR nurse. We are very defensive of our area. We're very protective of each other. We fight.
Yes, we are.
Fight like dogs during the day, but anybody from the outside comes in and we're very defensive of each other. And you can't be that way when we have things going on with our patients that are impactful to their care. We've got to be able to invite those other people in. To Garrett's point, we've got to break down those silos because we're not going to solve the problems on our own. We need those other sets of eyes on it. We need that out of the box thinking of, well, why are you doing it this way? As a surveyor, do you know how many times I've asked the question, well, why do you do why have you chosen to do it this way? And it's because, well, that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah, that's how it's trained.
Yeah.
And so when you get a different set of eyes that starts to ask why you do it that way, and we find out that, hey, we did it because Mary, who worked here 30 years ago, came up with this process. And this is just a really bad process, that we're open to change and we're open to listening to others. But that's the responsibility of both parties. Because I can't come in and say, well, you're doing this wrong, because that's automatically going to put anybody on the defensive, right? It's just how you approach that conversation, and then, being open to looking at what you're doing and ensuring that you are doing it from that standpoint of safe patient care.
I think that's an excellent, we'll just call it a silo breaker for IPs listening and OR staff listening to when we start that SSI investigation process. After listening to this episode, go out and just start to build that relationship. That seems to be one of the big through lines, is don't just show up with a clipboard and saying you're doing this wrong. Go and say, I don't know, Jeremy, is it best to go in as a student and say, hey, show me what you do. I want to understand. How have you seen that work really well for IP to go in, or for the OR to understand the IP process?
Yeah, from an infection preventionist standpoint, Lindsey, I hope you agree here. I think if you go in just like that, Garrett, and say, can you just show me what you do?
Yes.
Just walk me through your processes. I may ask some questions, and if I'm not coming to, please don't take me as I'm judging what you do. It's just because I don't understand, why you do it this way.
Yeah.
Then you're opening yourself up, or you're allowing yourself to be taught by the individual, and it just creates that dialogue. And then, and it's the same thing. It's the same thing when the OR staff are going down into sterile processing. I mean, you've really kind of got three silos here. You've got a silo between sterile processing and the OR, and then a silo between infection control in both of those departments. Because, again, you have the same thing happen when infection control pops down to sterile processing, and they've got their clipboard in their hand, and, they spent, the last week maybe reading up on reprocessing of surgical instrumentation. Nobody's an expert. And the best way to obtain information from an infection preventionist standpoint is having a good working relationship with the frontline staff. Your director is going to know how to do it. they're going to know the right answer. Having that working relationship with the frontline staff, the circulators, the surgical techs, the sterile processing techs, and, I hope that as an infection preventionist, you're not just showing up, once every quarter. That's where that relationship then breaks down, is because infection prevention's here. We got to do everything right. If you're there on a regular basis and they see your face and they interact with you, then they're more likely to pick up the phone and say, hey, so-and-so company brought this new instrument set, and I'm not sure that we have the capacity. Could you come down and take a look at it from an infection prevention standpoint? That's the ideal situation, right? Mm-hmm. Is you've got frontline staff now calling infection prevention, asking for, hey, advice. Doesn't mean that infection preventionist is the expert, but it does mean that they're at least including them in the conversation and saying, hey, come look at this process and let's see from your perspective if we're doing the right thing.
I love that. And that is an excellent thing to do. Yep. That is excellent. Well, Jeremy and Lindsey, thank you very much for joining us for part 1 of this conversation. For everybody, we'll be back with part 2 with Jeremy and Lindsey to talk about the nitty-gritty of the investigative process, how we mitigate that risk, and the role of the IPC plan for keeping our patients safe.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.